America is a land of risk takers. From the men who brought flight to the masses, to the woman who spent her life pushing the limits. It's a land of innovation. From a colony some hoped could exist on Mars, to a city others thought would be a blueprint for the future. This is a place where good ideas have made millionaires, and a good golf swing produced a billionaire. From self-made men to man-made products, these are the big thinkers, big dreams, and big things that could only be made in the USA. In the evergreens of Washington State is one company that's made America a computing superpower: Microsoft. This is the software giant's headquarters just outside Seattle, in Redmond. Bill Gates, a Seattle native, dropped out of Harvard in 1975 to start the company in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He relocated to Washington in 1979. A year later, Gates got a call about developing a top-secret operating system. It was for something unheard of at the time, an IBM personal computer. In Redmond, Microsoft's employees have perks like a soccer field, baseball diamond, and 25 high-end cafeterias. A few lucky workers even get to visit the boss's house. Proof of just how much money can be made in the USA. Bill Gates' multi-million-dollar estate on Lake Washington features a reception hall and conference facilities in case he needs to take work home with him. One of the libraries contains a Leonardo da Vinci notebook, which Gates bought in 1994 for more than $30 million. And while the home's exterior is traditional, the inside is, of course, state-of-the-art. A house computer can detect what temperature and music each resident prefers. Another major American brand was made in Seattle, Starbucks. The company started out as a small shop in nearby Pike Place Market, where it opened in 1971. In 1983, marketing director Howard Schultz went to Milan, Italy, and noticed the popularity of espresso bars. He convinced Starbucks founders to try out the coffeehouse concept, and now Starbucks is sold in 55 countries. Their signature mermaid comes from a 16th century Norse woodcut. It pays tribute to Seattle's seaport roots and the seafaring history of coffee. A Washington outdoorsman made it big in the USA after a near-death experience. In the 1930s, a man named Eddie Bauer was hauling fish he had just caught through the Olympic Peninsula. Soon, he started sweating in his wool clothes and developed hypothermia. Afterwards, Bauer came up with an idea for a goose-down breathable jacket. an invention that revolutionized cold weather outerwear. He hit it really big in World War II, when the down-filled bomber jackets he made for fighter pilots became the height of fashion. The war also made a fortune for another Washington businessman, named William Boeing. He flew as a passenger for the first time in 1914, just 11 years after the Wright brothers' Virgin flight. Boeing had been running a successful timber company, but once he was airborne, decided he could build a better plane. In 2 years, he learned to fly, hired engineers, and took his new plane for a test flight. At first, the company struggled. Then, Boeing started flying letters from Vancouver to Seattle, America's first international airmail. Boeing also started repairing and manufacturing military planes, eventually building World War II bombers. The company is a top producer of passenger aircraft, many of which are made here, 25 miles north of Seattle. This is Boeing's Mammoth Everett plant, the largest building in the world when measured by volume. Inside, it's the equivalent of 75 football fields. Behind massive bay doors, Boeing builds 4 models of planes. The aircraft emerge with a green mylar coating to prevent damage. This is also where Boeing builds the 787 Dreamliner, which offers passengers Wi-Fi, live TV, and cell phone use. After a few hundred tests, the plane is ready for delivery. But William Boeing certainly wasn't the only one fascinated by flight. His fellow flying mavericks just happened to be taking off in Kansas. In the mid-20s, Wichita resident Lloyd Stearman started designing biplanes like these, the main aircraft used in those early aviation years. The planes are still flying nearly 90 years later. A Stearman biplane even starred in Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest, where it was used to try and murder Cary Grant. While some businessmen were building planes, an American woman was making history with one. Amelia Earhart was born in Atchison, where Kansas artist Stan Hurd pays tribute to her with a 1-acre earthen portrait. Growing up, Earhart spent much of her time here in her grandparents' house high above the Missouri River. As a girl, she was independent and even kept a scrapbook of accomplished women. In 1928, Earhart gained worldwide fame when she became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic. She was driven in part by a desire to help women achieve social and economic independence, often using her fame to advocate for female pilots and women's issues. But her attempt to be the first woman around the world came to a tragic end when she disappeared over the Pacific, a mysterious death that sometimes overshadows her lifetime of accomplishments. In the remote plains of western Kansas is a town that remade itself after a devastating tragedy. In 2007, a massive tornado leveled the small community of Greensburg. Half of the survivors decided not to come back, but the population here had actually been decreasing for years. City leaders decided they didn't just need to rebuild, they needed to revitalize. Their idea was to make Greensburg the greenest town in America. It was a tough sell to residents, but they gradually began to rally. Soon, eco-homes like this rose, modeled after a grain silo that withstood the tornado's 200-mile-per-hour winds. The 547 Arts Center was the first public building to go up, part of the town's decision to make the arts a priority. The Kansas architectural students who designed it named it after the date the tornado hit. The town's library and museum, which were also destroyed, now live in the award-winning Kiowa County Commons building. Its roof overhang, awnings, and trees control the amount of light and heat that enter, while solar panels generate power. But the building that may symbolize Greensburg's rebirth best is the spiral-shaped museum, the new entrance to the town's oldest attraction, the Big Well. The building sits atop the largest hand-dug well in the world. The structure is modeled after the Fibonacci sequence, a series of numbers that creates spirals found in nature, including tornadoes. Kansas has also helped make the USA more eco-friendly by harnessing the power of the wind. BP is behind this wind farm called Flat Ridge 2 in south-central Kansas. The wind industry has skyrocketed in the U.S., outpaced only by China. But to tap into the wind's potential, some assembly is required. The windmills arrive in pieces, which are then spread out on the prairie. Each one will sit on a concrete pad where its transformer is located. Workers assemble the 3 tubes that will make up the windmill's tower, then attach the giant propeller blades to their hub. Once that's finished, a powerful motor goes on top. Finally, the propeller is ready to be installed. In this delicate dance between man and machine, each gear and part must be perfectly aligned. When the workers are done, 262 windmills will tower over the Kansas plains, generating enough electricity for 125,000 homes. In nearby Oklahoma is the birthplace of the Doppler weather radar. This is the National Weather Center in Norman, where the Doppler was born out of World War II technology to detect enemy aircraft and missiles. In 1964, the radar allowed scientists to measure motion inside a storm for the first time. More recently, Doppler radar advanced to this, called OU Prime. It's one of the highest resolution radars of its kind. Researchers use it to help predict severe weather, a necessity in the middle of Tornado Alley. 1,400 miles away is one of the sites that helped Google become a household name. This is the company's server farm in the Dalles, Oregon. Inside are tens of thousands of processors that are part of the Googleplex, basically the biggest collective computer in the world. And powering all that creates a lot of heat, which is why this server farm is near the Columbia River. The Dalles Dam Hydroelectric Station and its half-mile powerhouse supply Google with cheap, renewable energy, something the company says is a priority as it continues to expand. Western Oregon is home to the track that helped make a sportswear giant, Nike. This is Hayward Field, or Tracktown, USA, at the University of Oregon in Eugene. In 1949, a man named Bill Bowerman became the track and field coach here. Known for his attention to detail, Bowerman even cobbled shoes for his runners. Then, in 1964, Bowerman went into the shoe business with former U of O runner Bill Knight. They started out selling sneakers from Japan, but in 1971 launched their own company, Nike, named after the Greek goddess of victory. At the company's Beaverton headquarters, Nike is still looking for ways to give runners an edge, inviting top athletes to train here. The campus's buildings bear the names of sports legends that have been sponsored by Nike, including Michael Jordan, Mia Hamm, and John McEnroe, all of whom were also made in the USA. Along the pristine waters of Jupiter Island, Florida, is the home of another athlete who made it big in America. This is Tiger Woods' 12-acre multi-million-dollar estate, which he kept as his permanent residence after his messy split with wife Elin Nordegren in 2010. The house includes 4 greens, all with different types of turf to replicate real courses. On the second floor is quite the custom add-on, Woods' own personal driving range. Up the Florida coast is a city that's made the USA a leader in space exploration. Cape Canaveral is home to the Kennedy Space Center, a long-standing testament to the power of American ingenuity. Here at Pad 39A, astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins blasted off, as did 135 space shuttle missions. Towering over this stretch of coast is NASA's Vehicle Assembly Building, the largest single-story structure in the world. Inside, engineers assembled every single space shuttle. Before launch, shuttles were rolled out and onto this 135-foot wide path called the Crawlerway. The 17-million-pound spacecraft sat on giant crawler transporters that, because of the crushing weight, couldn't move faster than a mile per hour. Tracks from the last one to make this journey are still visible. This is also where America's astronauts returned to Earth, aiming for 2 black strips on the tarmac. The Space Shuttle program ended in 2011. Now, NASA is looking for new ways to put its historic infrastructure to use. Florida may be famous for its Made in the USA oranges, but it turns out the fruit isn't actually native to the state. Spanish settlers brought it here from China in the 16th century. It took another few hundred years for oranges to catch on. The fruit ripens in the fall, and thousands of migrant laborers are hired to help with the harvest. Racing between the rows are trucks called goats that gather the fruit from workers and ferry it to nearby tractor trailers. The oranges then travel to nearby processing plants, like this one, owned by Florida's Natural. The company got its start in 1933 as a small co-op. Now, it's one of the biggest orange juice producers in the country. Open trailer trucks take the fruit from farm to factory. Inside, millions of oranges a year are turned to pulp, their juice pasteurized and bottled before it makes its way around the world. Thousands of miles away from Florida, another American product had more mysterious beginnings on the tropical islands of Hawaii. These are the Dole pineapple plantations on Oahu, and one of Hawaii's main sources of revenue. But no one knows exactly how the pineapple ended up here. What historians do know is that a Spanish adventurer successfully started raising them in the 1800s. Then, at the turn of the century, a Harvard grad named James Drummond Dole came to Oahu and thought the fruit might have potential. Putting his business and agricultural degrees to use, Dole bought some land and started using the relatively new technology called canning. After some persistent marketing, the pineapple became a symbol of friendship and a staple in many kitchens. Thousands of miles away, California winemakers are busy producing Made in the USA reds. Vineyards in Paso Robles have been around since the 18th century, when Franciscan friars started making wine here. In the 1870s, commercial winemaking began with an Indiana rancher named Andrew York. He had a surplus of grapes, so he started the Ascension Winery, which eventually became the York Winery, among the oldest in the country. Paso Robles is now home to dozens of wineries that produce the region's signature big reds, including Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Syrah, and Zinfandel. In the 1870s, many men went west in search of gold. But one man dreamt of making a fortune on something else: beer. German-born Adolf Coors hiked through the foothills of Golden, Colorado, looking for his key ingredient: sparkling clean water. Coors and a partner converted an old tannery into a brewery, then shipped their beer to thirsty miners. When Prohibition hit, Coors stayed afloat by manufacturing cement and other products. And when Prohibition ended, his beer endured. In the 50s, Coors unveiled the all-aluminum beer can, which quickly made steel ones obsolete. And it's rumored that Coors was a favorite of President Gerald Ford, who apparently brought it aboard Air Force One. 4 decades later, President Barack Obama would reach for a different American beer: Yuengling. Before Coors, German immigrant David Yuengling started making his beer in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. Here, the water was soft and clean. There were thousands of beer-drinking German immigrants, and the nearby railroad made shipping easy. Yuengling did well locally for years. Then, in the 80s, it gained steam nationally. That's when Yuengling's great-grandson solved the problem of how to pronounce the beer's name by reintroducing an old brew and calling it simply lager. Today, Yuengling is the oldest operating beer company in America. About an hour away from the brewery is one of the largest chocolate manufacturers in North America, Hershey Chocolate Company in Hershey, Pennsylvania. Founder Milton Hershey grew up on a nearby farm, where his father took on one failed venture after another. After his dad left, Hershey's mother taught him a strong work ethic, which saw Milton through years of failure until he made a fortune on caramel. In 1893, he was fascinated by chocolate making at the Chicago World's Fair. At the time, milk chocolate was a delicacy produced mostly by the Swiss. In 1905, Hershey opened up a factory in his hometown and started bringing chocolate to the masses. He also gave back, starting the Hershey School to give disadvantaged kids a good education. Another Pennsylvania entrepreneur made it big with ketchup. Pittsburgh native Henry John Heinz started out selling horseradish, which did well until the economy collapsed. After being broke for a few years, Heinz borrowed money from his brother and started bottling ketchup in 1876. One component of his success? A clear glass bottle. Consumers liked to see what they were buying. By 1900, Heinz was the leading manufacturer of ketchup and other condiments. A Michigan businessman changed the USA forever in 1908 when he debuted the Model T Ford. Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile, but he did make it affordable by drastically cutting assembly costs. Early cars were handcrafted by specialized workers, a long, slow process. With an assembly line, Ford managed to dramatically cut the Model T's production time. Once the automobile started selling, Ford put the money back into his business, lowering the car's price from $825 to $575 in just 4 years. By 1914, nearly half the cars on American roads were Model Ts. And with those profits, Ford bought 1,300 acres on the banks of the nearby Rogue River, where he built the Fairlane Estate. Ford was proud of his modest roots and told builders not to spend more than $250,000 But after 2 years and 56 rooms, the total bill was nearly $2.5 million. The home featured a hydroelectric power station, built with design help from Ford's friend, Thomas Edison. Two generators on the river powered the estate, along with 2,000 other nearby homes. Ford paid tribute to Edison and other American inventors at a one-of-a-kind site, Greenfield Village in Dearborn. This is where Ford transported and recreated dozens of notable homes from around the world. Among them, Edison's Invention Factory, part of which came from Menlo Park, New Jersey. The village also features the Wright Brothers Workshop and a courthouse where Abe Lincoln practiced law. Ford and Edison had something else in common: their visits to the Seventh-day Adventist Sanitarium in Battle Creek, health spa to the rich and famous. In 1876, a surgeon and inventor named Dr. John Harvey Kellogg took over the site, insisting patients follow a regimen of vegetarianism, colonics, and daily exercise. Dr. Harvey and his brother Will were always researching healthier food options. One day, while trying to make a bread substitute, Will left out boiled wheat too long. He rolled and baked it anyway, accidentally inventing what would eventually become cornflakes. Sanitarium patients loved it, even asking to have the cereal shipped to their homes. Will went on to found the Kellogg Company, creating a permanent rift between the brothers. By 1906, Kellogg's was a household name. More than 5 decades later, Michigan produced something else that would take the USA by storm: the Motown sound. In 1959, at the urging of his friend Smokey Robinson, a songwriter named Berry Gordy founded Motown Records in this modest Detroit house. 1 year later, the company had its first hit with Shop Around, written and performed by Robinson and his band, The Miracles. Gordy, a former auto worker, knew from the car business that to keep consumers happy, he had to produce fast. And for the next decade, he did, with talent like The Temptations, The Four Tops, The Supremes, and many more. The hit factory thrived through the 60s until 1972, when Gordy set up shop in Hollywood. In 1988, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But the Motown sound might never have existed had it not been for Clarksdale, Mississippi, and the blues. The music has its roots in the Mississippi Delta, at juke joints where African Americans gathered in the early 1900s to dance, drink, and listen to music. Blues is said to have started south of here in Tutwiler. A band leader named W.C. Handy heard a fellow traveler playing what Handy called the weirdest music he'd ever heard. 9 years later, Handy published Memphis Blues, the first song with blues in its title. Clarksdale is home to the Delta Blues Museum, housed in an old freight depot. It also celebrates musicians with close ties to the town, including Charlie Patton, Son House, Robert Johnson, and Muddy Waters. It's said Muddy boarded a bus right here, joining 6 million black Southerners in the Great Migration North. "I'm gonna pack my suitcase," he sang, "and make my getaway." The exposure Muddy Waters' music found in Chicago launched the Delta blues into the mainstream, changing music forever. Another Southerner came up with something hot in the bayous of Louisiana. In the mid-1800s, a man named Edmund McIlhenny moved to Avery Island after marrying into the Avery family. Their main staples were salt and sugarcane. But Edmund grew Tabasco plants as a hobby. When the Civil War started, the family fled. They returned to find the salt mines flooded and the sugarcane burned. But the red pepper plants were flourishing. Edmund, a talented cook, allowed the peppers to age and ferment so he could make a spicy sauce. In 1868, he sent samples in small cologne bottles to food distributors and called it Tabasco. These days, most of Tabasco's peppers come from Mexico, but every bottle is still filled at this factory on Avery Island. From Alabama to Texas are fields of white. These are cotton plants, a major source of income in the South since slaves painstakingly picked it in the 1700s. Then, an inventor named Eli Whitney came south as a tutor and saw how hard it was to separate the seeds from the cotton. He created a cotton gin that, unlike its predecessors, could handle the short staple cotton commonly grown in the South. But before Whitney could profit from the invention, others illegally copied it. He left the South broke and frustrated. Whitney went north to pursue another idea: mass production. He started making something new, machine-made, interchangeable parts. His model went on to help spur the Industrial Revolution. Other farmland in Alabama produced something far different. One of the fastest racetracks in America, the Talladega Superspeedway. It opened in 1969, the latest addition to the NASCAR circuit, one of the biggest spectator sports in the world. The first organized NASCAR race was in Daytona Beach in 1948, on the actual beach. Over the next 2 decades, stock car racing would explode, hitting the airwaves the same year Talladega opened, and producing stars like Pete Hamilton and David Pearson. In the 80s and 90s, the track was dominated by Dale Earnhardt before his death during a 2001 Daytona race. The accident led to rigorous new safety measures in the sport. Nearly 600 miles from the Speedway is a place that couldn't be more different: the very peaceful town of Green Bank, West Virginia. Home to the Green Bank Radio Telescope, the world's biggest land-based movable structure. Radio astronomers use it to learn more about outer space, but they need things to be very quiet. That's part of the reason they chose this town. The Allegheny Mountains protect it from much man-made noise. On top of that, residents can't use cell phones, digital cameras, or Wi-Fi connections because the signals would interfere with the astronomers' work. In the western part of the state is what some call a work of structural art. The New River Gorge Bridge, the longest single-arch steel bridge in the world. Before it was built, drivers had to take a 40-mile trip around the gorge. Bridge construction began in 1974, with engineers stringing cables between towers on either side. The challenge of a single arch design is that the weight of the structure pushes outward from the arch, threatening to make the bridge sag. But in this case, the mountain provides rock-solid support. Some of the greatest architecture made in the USA came from the man behind this masterpiece, Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright and his students started coming to Arizona in 1933 to escape the bitter winters in Wright's home state of Wisconsin. In 1937, he purchased this land outside Scottsdale to build a permanent winter retreat and school of architecture. Wright's work focused on organic architecture. Taliesin's buildings are low, tucked into the mountains. Wright and his students would come back to Taliesin West every winter until his death in 1959 at the age of 91. Arizona is also home to one of the most unique structures ever made in the USA. This is Biosphere 2 in the town of Oracle outside Tucson. In 1991, scientists sealed 8 people inside it for 2 years to see if humans might be able to colonize another planet. Inside, they had a working farm, along with replicas of an ocean, savanna, and rainforest. Scientists learned a great deal, but that was largely overshadowed by infighting between biospherians and some of their bosses. Biosphere 2 is now owned by the University of Arizona, which uses it to study climate change and ecology, among other things. Elsewhere in Arizona, another visionary has different ideas about how the future should look. 70 miles north of Phoenix is the community of Arcosanti, the work of Italian architect Paolo Soleri. In 1970, long before going green was popular, he started constructing arcologies here, buildings that blend ecology and architecture. Soleri wanted to introduce a new kind of carless city living that could also save the planet. His urban experiment also incorporated green efforts like solar power. Over the decades, people have come from around the world to live and work at Arcosanti. But the total population never approached the 5,000 mark Soleri envisioned. From forward-thinking architects in the Southwest to resourceful townspeople in the Midwest. What's made in the USA has changed drastically over the decades. In the early 1900s, Americans were just beginning to take flight. Within 70 years, some were landing space shuttles. This is a country that went from driving the auto industry to powering the internet. And from singing the blues to that groundbreaking Motown sound. Regardless of how the technology or landscape may change, one thing will remain the same. America will continue to reinvent itself.